I am the Houston half of this team. We're the only twin act in the business. My brother Merle and I grew up in a small town in northeast Texas back in the late 40s, 50s, when the South was a solid Democratic South. That was in the 1st Congressional District, Wright Patman's old district, for those of you who know your Southern history. And we've had a lifelong interest in trying to understand, first of all, the very tremendous changes that have taken place, especially in the South, over the lifetime of just about everybody in this audience. So, the rise of the Civil Rights Movement, the tremendous impact, the passage of the Civil Rights Act, 1964, Voting Rights Act, incorporation of all elements of Southern politics into the voting electorate, and ending the shame of racial discrimination that had characterized the South for so long. And the other big story in Southern politics, of course, has been the rise of two-party politics, which did not exist, as anybody who is as old as we are understands, a long time ago. So we focused on the South and did in fact write 3 books together. I might say we've now done 4 books without a single fist fight. And those of you who've had brothers or sisters understand what an accomplishment that is. But we've now in our new book, Divided America, we have tried to understand what we think is the central feature of modern American politics, which is, at the national level, very close competition for every elected branch of the government, the White House, the House of Representatives, and the Senate. It's been a long time since every one of these elected institutions could conceivably change in the next election cycle. And what we have today at the national level, anytime we turn the television on, we can consume this, is a ferocious power struggle that is carried out on a daily basis, nonstop, have more means of communication these days to do that than ever before. Now, the argument of divided South is that in order to understand why we have this closely divided national politics, it's very important to understand the key geographical regions of the United States, because the very close national party battle is really not duplicated in most of the regions. So the close national battle is the product of cross-currents in which both of our major political parties now have developed 2 big, important regional strongholds. And that produces, at the national level, or at least did through 2004, we look at voters. We're looking at surveys, the exit polls since 1976, other academic surveys before that, but we're concentrating on voters. And when we look at voters, as of 2004 at the national level, the parties are basically tied in terms of partisanship. That is, roughly the same proportion of American voters call themselves Democrats as call themselves Republicans. Now, for Democrats, that tie as of 2004 actually represented a relative decline compared to previous decades, because ever since the Great Depression, the Republicans had been reduced to a very uncompetitive minority party. So what I think happened at the national level was that we view the 1980s as the critical decade here. Ronald Reagan's presidency brings about a realignment that raises the Republican Party nationally from the level of a truly uncompetitive national party in terms of party identification to one that as of 2004, basically was tied across the nation with the Democrats. But in order to understand this close national battle, we have looked in this book. The first half of the book sort of focuses on the electorates at the regional level, and the second half of the book looks at the power struggle as it is expressed or has been expressed in the House of Representatives, the Senate, and the presidency. So what we do that I think is unique here is we combine trying to understand electorates at the regional level with understanding patterns of office holding. And to put those two together in one book is not something that is done very often. So what we find is that we now have a unique configuration at the regional level of power in American politics. Each of our two major political parties has developed two regional strongholds. For the Republicans, the novelty, of course, is a Republican South. See it most clearly in presidential politics, where in the last two presidential elections, the Republicans have had virtually complete success, and the Mountain Plains. Now, the South is by far the largest single region in the United States. In terms of total population, electoral college votes, representation in the House of Representatives, it's the biggest region of these five regions. The Mountain Plains is a much smaller region in terms of population. A lot of states, not many people. So what that means is in the House of Representatives, it's not nearly as important in terms of size. But in the Senate, we define the Mountain Plains as 13 states. Well, that's 26 senators. That's a quarter of the United States Senate elected from the underpopulated Mountain Plain states. So the power of the Mountain Plains in national politics is expressed not so much in the Electoral College or in the House, but rather in the Senate because of the size of the states in that region. When you put the South and the Mountain Plains together, then that gives the Republican Party, or has in recent politics, two important regional strongholds. Put them together in terms of Electoral College, House seats, Senate seats. It's a starting point for Republican competition in the nation, but it is not a majority in and of itself. So for the Republicans, Mountain Plains plus South makes the Republicans competitive, but does not guarantee at all national victories. The Republican gain, sort of symbolized in the Congress by the Republican advances in 1994. In that year, as you remember, that was the first time the Republicans won the House of Representatives in more than 4 decades. And it was based in part on Republican gains across the nation, but the really novel feature was, for the first time in 1994, Republicans gained a narrow majority of the Southern delegation to the House. That had never before happened since Reconstruction. Since 1994, the Republican share of the Southern House delegation has increased. Today, it's a little bit under 60%. And the Southern House delegation, 131 representatives from the 11 states. We define the South as the old Confederacy, the 11 states of the old Confederacy. That gives the Republicans a continuing advantage in the South. In part because what the Republicans have tried to do is to become a competitive majority party by emphasizing conservative ideology. As it turns out, the market for conservative ideology is largest and most consistent in the South and the Mountain Plains. But as we move away from those two regions, conservatism diminishes. And it diminishes most of all in relative terms in the two regional strongholds of the modern Democratic Party. The Democratic Party has revived, we saw in 2006, the first time the Democrats had really taken advantage of the underlying patterns in the electorate, especially in the Northeast. In the Northeast, the Democrats now have their strongest electoral base in the nation. Many of the northeastern states are not at all competitive for the Republicans. They are easy states, especially in presidential politics, under just about all circumstances, for the Democrats. And then the Democrats have combined that regional base in the Northeast with now newfound strength in the Pacific Coast. And here the key state is California in presidential politics. Before 1992, the Republican Party had carried California in presidential elections. In every election from 1952 through 1988, with the single exception of 1964, the Goldwater-Johnson presidential election, where Lyndon Johnson wins a national landslide, creates the context for passing the Great Society, and the Republicans lost California with Goldwater at the top of their ticket. But that was the only presidential election from 1952 through 1988 where the Republicans lost California. California, of course, is the grand prize in terms of states in presidential politics, 53 electoral votes. Starting in 1992, Bill Clinton's first election, the Democrats have carried California by huge, impressive margins in the last 4 presidential elections. So when California ceased to be a state that the Republicans could usually win, although not by much, but remember, presidential politics is winner take all. Doesn't matter whether you win by 1 million votes or 5 votes. You get all the electoral votes. When the Republicans lost California in presidential politics, that really consolidated Democratic strength in the Pacific Coast. So when we add the Pacific Coast to the Northeast, we have the 2 regional strongholds of the modern Democratic Party. And that makes our 2 parties now, gives our 2 parties a firm basis for competition for presidency, the House, and the Senate. In the Pacific Coast and in the Northeast, in the electorate, the Democrats have a substantial advantage. It's not close. On the Republican side, the electorate in the mountain plains in the South, viewed as total regions, it's not close either. It's a very substantial Republican advantage at the level of the regions. Individual states might become competitive, but at the level of the regions, it's not competitive. So we have 4 of the regions where the party battle favors one party or the other fairly decisively. The region that is left, the one that has an electorate that through 2004 is basically tied in terms of partisanship, is the Midwest. And so the Midwest becomes not just the swing region, it's the region that both parties need to carry in presidential politics to combine with their 2 regional strongholds in order to make majorities. And recall that the last 2 presidential elections have been the 2 closest consecutive presidential elections, I suspect, in American history. Maybe, I'm pretty sure that's the case. So what we have now is a situation where the basic strategy in presidential politics for both parties is carry your base, carry your regional foundations, and try to do it absolutely. And with winner take all in presidential elections, that's possible. Republicans carried their entire base in 2004. The Democrats carried their entire base with the sole exception of the state of Alaska, which has to be considered a Pacific Coast state, has 3 electoral votes. That's the only exception on the Pacific Coast. So you've got the parties maxing out in their regional strongholds in presidential politics and winning big majorities of House and Senate seats in those strongholds as well. That leaves the battle in the Midwest. And in presidential politics in recent years, the Democrats have had a lot of success in the Great Lakes states. States like Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, states that frequently went Republican in the 1980s in presidential elections. The key state in the Midwest that has been the most important swing state of the swing region, of course, is Ohio. Now, in the last 2 presidential elections, Ohio is the only really large urban industrial state in the North carried by the Republicans. Think of what a huge change that is in the 1980s. In the 1980s, the Republicans in presidential politics had 3 consecutive national landslides. Reagan twice, followed by Bush Sr. in 1988. In those 3 presidential campaigns, the Republicans carried their traditional base in the North, and they added the South. They became a national party. That's gone. And we think it's unlikely that that's going to come back. The only exception would be for either party if they nominate a presidential candidate who cannot even carry the base, can't even carry the regional strongholds. then that would create a context for a national landslide victory. But that's probably not going to happen. It could happen, but it's less likely than we have the pattern that we talk about. So what we have now is a battle at the national level between these two competitive parties. But a battle that when in our book, when we break down the regions, and this is the thing that separates our book from most studies of American politics, when you look at it at a regional level, what you see is parties that are fighting it out, slugging it out almost every day to maintain an advantage, because when the national battle is so tight for the presidency, the House, and the Senate, there's no incentive to compromise. The party out of power thinks with another issue or two it can become the party in power, so why compromise? And the other factor that is driving our national politics that we think is quite unique, and we show in the book, is the ideological purity of our two major parties, a conservative Republican Party, a liberal Democratic Party, has never been higher in the United States than it is today. That's also very important, because we have fights taking place over not just partisan differences, but partisan differences that are now reinforced by ideological differences. So it makes it a whole lot more difficult for national leaders of either party to be seen as a compromiser, as somebody who is selling out the strongest activist groups within each of the major parties. It contributes to the very shrill tone of our national politics. So the basic structure of our book is to start off in the first chapter with a national portrait, then decompose the nation to the regions, and then in the final chapter bring it back to the level of the nation again, and try to talk about the main characteristics of our very ferocious national politics. There's a reason why we use the word ferocious in the subtitle. I believe we use it in the first sentence of the book as well. Because I don't think that's an exaggeration of the tone of modern American politics. And most of us in this audience are old enough to remember a time when that was not necessarily the case. I'm going to stop now and let my brother develop and embellish on these things.
We may have our first fist fight right here. I thought we had a division of labor where I was going to talk about some of those things he's just talked about. So I was sitting over there listening to him and saying, okay, can't talk about that, can't talk about that. Talk about something else. I'll rise to the occasion. I want to develop some of these themes in a little bit more detail. One of the reasons why we have the two political parties, the Democrats more liberal than ever before, the Republicans more conservative than ever before, and more conservative in different ways than historically, is that American conservatism was split by the Civil War and the aftermath of the Civil War. Conservatives in the North were Republicans, for the most part. Conservatives in the South were Democrats. So one of the really big impacts of the Reagan realignment in the 1980s was bringing white conservatives, a majority of whom were not Republicans when Reagan took office in 1980, bringing white conservatives into the Republican Party, so that when Reagan left office, a large majority of white conservatives now call themselves Republicans. That's the Reagan realignment. And that process has accelerated in recent elections, so that now overwhelmingly large majorities of white conservatives consider themselves Republicans, and very few, less than 10%, still call themselves Democrats. Well, this had two major effects. One is it really moved the National Republican Party to the right, as conservatives came to be a much larger portion of the Republican Party, and also because of the regional nature. I mean, when you look at politics in terms of these regions, you really see a lot of stuff that gets disguised or canceled out when you just look at the national level of politics. The Republican Party today, grounded in the South and the Mountain Plains, is a different type of conservatism, more conservative on a wider range of issues. than the Republican Party was historically when it was really based in the Northeast and the Midwest. So there's a qualitative difference. And a lot of that has to do with evangelical Protestants. We have one figure in the book. We use some figures here. The figures we think are very reader-friendly. All these figures tell a story. They tell important stories. And they summarize a lot of events that take place either over time or at the same point across the regions in time. But one of the figures we show is the percentage of evangelical Protestants as you go from the Northeast to the South. So if you want to think, are there regional differences in American politics? Yeah, if you look at it, the right way. If you array the regions from the most liberal Democratic region on the left, the Northeast, the South over there on the right, and then put the Pacific Coast next to the Northeast as the next most liberal region, put the Mountain Plains next to the South, and then put the Midwest right in the dead center. If you do it that way, you see very large regional differences in terms of conservatism, in terms of evangelical Protestants. Evangelical Protestants very large in the South, very, very small in the Northeast. So here's George Bush, evangelical Protestant president. That's almost a non-starter in the Northeast in terms of a Republican Party. It's a different type of conservatism, a different emphasis on religion. Well, what we're doing in this book is really taking conservative ideology that happened in the 1980s and showing how it affected the Republican Party, but it also had an impact indirectly on the Democratic Party, because historically the Democratic Party once had a fairly substantial conservative wing, made up largely of members from the South, but also other small-town Democrats from other portions of the country, small-town and rural Democrats elsewhere. There really isn't a truly conservative wing of the Democratic Party that can exert strong influence in the party today. The conservatives are vastly outnumbered by liberals or by moderate Democrats, and conservatives are not defining the agenda of the National Democratic Party today. So the exodus of conservatives from the Democratic Party, again, helped move the Democratic Party more in a liberal direction. So this added to the ideological polarization that we see in the parties today. Well, when you look at the battles for the party leadership, let me say a little bit about what happened in 2006 in terms of regional terms. Our book was finished. We turned the manuscript in January of 2006, well before the elections. And what we argue in the first chapter of the book is that each of these institutions of American politics, the White House, the House, and the Senate, can change party control in every election cycle now. The divisions are so close that if the circumstances move in the right way, the out party, the minority party, can become the majority party in the next presidential election. That's what we argued when we turned the manuscript in. Well, in the fall of 2006, Democrats regained control of the House and Senate. That's exactly what we're talking about in this book. And if you look overall, the Democrats hold the Senate, 51-49, 2-seat, Democrats may have an advantage in holding the South when you look at specific elections, but no Republican Party strategist is going to say, okay, we can't win the Senate, we're 2 seats short. Well, if you do that, you shouldn't be running the party. You should get somebody else to run the party, somebody not a defeatist, etc. The House, the Democratic advantage in the House is just a little bit larger than the Republican advantage going into the 2006 elections. So it looks like in principle it might change. The White House, clearly, most people would think the Democrats are in great position to retake the presidency the next time out or so. That's in accord with the theory here. But what we're really arguing is the presidency looks, right now, quite contestable for both parties, depending on the nominees. Well, what happened in 2006? What we show in the book is, in terms of the House and the Senate, you have this very pronounced regional tilt in American politics, where large majorities of House members from the Northeast and Pacific Coast are Democrats, and large majorities of House members from the South and Mountain Plains are Republicans. In 2000, and the Midwest, going into the 2006 elections, Midwest has 100 congressional seats. The Republicans held 60 seats, and the Democrats only 40. So in the House of Representatives, the Midwest was really acting very, very pro-Republican going into that round of elections. What happened? Well, this is where regional analysis really helps you understand what went on. In 2006, the Democratic majorities in their regional strongholds, the Northeast and the Pacific Coast, got larger. They strengthened and especially the Northeast. I'll come back to that in a minute. In the Republican strongholds, the Republican majority in the South got smaller. Republican majority in the Mountain Plains got smaller also. But still you have majorities of Republicans elected in those congressional delegations from the South and from the Mountain Plains. Big change in the Midwest. In the Midwest, Republicans dropped from 60 to 51 seats. Democrats went from 40 to 49. So the Mideast almost dead even. This is how kind of we see the Midwest right now. A dead even can go swing region, go either way. Really depend on short-term factors out there. So the Republican loss of strength in the Midwest really helped Democrats regain control of the House. But the big change was in the Northeast. Now, we know a lot about the realignment in the South. The South moves from a overwhelmingly Democratic region to a region now where the Republicans have a plurality among voters. It's not a majority. It's not anywhere among voters. It's not anywhere like the old solid Democratic South. Nothing to compare to that. But Republicans do have an advantage, according to the exit polls, in terms of voters, about a 7-point advantage. The South has 131 congressional seats. The Democratic, the Republican margin in the South going into these elections in 2006 was over 30 seats. That is, there 30 more Republicans than Democrats came out of the South to the Congress. That meant that if the Democrats want to control House of Representatives, they've got to get more than 30 somewhere else in the nation to offset that 30 surplus coming out from the South. And the Northeast, at that time, had a Democratic surplus, but it was somewhere in the 20s. So the South trumped Northeast. Republicans controlled Congress. Okay, in the 2006 election, the Northeast is going down in relative size. There are 11 states in the Northeast, but in terms of relative population growth, much lower than in the South. The Northeast now has only 91 congressional seats. 92. The South has 131, Northeast has 92. And that's in the future. The South is projected now by 2030 to contain 34 to 35% of the entire American population. Realize that? 34 to 35% of the entire American population in the 11 states of the old Confederacy by 2030. Huge population growth in the South. The Northeast is projected to go down, the Midwest projected to go down also. So if you look, and you see a lot of analyses out there too, the Northeast losing seats, the South gaining seats, etc. Republicans aided, Democrats hurt. Not necessarily. Not necessarily. It depends upon the percentage of those seats that are won by a particular party. And what happened in the Northeast? In our book, what we show when we do the voters in the Northeast, the Democrats are right at about 50% of voters. Republicans are below 40% of voters in the Northeast. There's a huge Democratic advantage in the Northeast. We know about the Southern realignment. What individuals don't really appreciate too much is there's a realignment in the Northeast, because 50 years ago, the Northeast was the most Republican part of the United States. That's the reason that nominates Eisenhower for president, 1950, Rockefeller Republican, et cetera, et cetera. The Northeast, in the last 50 years, has become the most Democratic region in the United States. This is what, and one of the chapters in the book deals with this realignment of voters in the Northeast. Okay, in the congressional elections in the Northeast, 92 seats, the Democrats had huge gains, and Republicans had huge losses. So that after the elections, the Democrats now hold 68 seats in the Northeast, and the Republicans only 24. Okay? 68 minus 24, 44-seat Democratic surplus out of the Northeast. That's almost twice as large as the Republican surplus out of the entire, much larger South. Size is important, but also cohesion. How unified is the region in terms of its partisanship? So as the South's become more Republican, Northeast become a lot more Democratic. And that produced, that 44-seat surplus out of the Northeast, well, that's the main factor why the Democrats control House of Representatives today. This is why it's really, really important to look in the different regions and see what the patterns are. And in future elections, can Democrats hold that? Can Republicans come back and challenge that? So, I leave that open. In terms of the Senate seats, the same percentage, the Northeast and the percentage of seats held by the Republicans in the South, 22 senators in the South, there's 17 Republicans and only 5 Democrats. In the Northeast, it's exactly reversed. There's 17 Democrats and only 5 Republicans. So at the level of the Senate, the Northeast has now neutralized the South. So, and the Midwest went up in terms of Democratic strength in the Senate elections in 2006. So when you look at the regional dynamics, that helps us understand what's going on in terms of American politics. And what happened in 2006 doesn't mean it's going to happen again in 2008. That's what makes politics interesting. The patterns can change depending on circumstances, issues, blah, blah, blah. Now, let me move from that to presidential politics. As we go into the 2008 presidential cycle, which is already underway, as we all know, right? Barack Obama was here in Atlanta just the other day, supposedly raised about $500,000, downtown Atlanta. The campaign is in full swing, and it's in full swing because a year from now, at this time in March of 2008, we'll know who the likely presidential candidates are from the two parties. Because both parties now are engaged in a process that's kind of out of their control. The parties don't control this. But the states are controlling the process. And we're seeing a big revolt by the largest states, American states right now, California, New York, Texas, Florida, Illinois, etc., New Jersey, in which the largest states, which sometimes came late in the process. California had their primaries in June, usually in June. It's all over with by June. Here's the largest state in the country. They have no direct influence on the nominees of either of the two political parties. So as you know, California has now passed legislation that moves up California to February the 5th, just 1 week after these kind of January primaries. Well, it's not just California that's moving up, it's all these other states too. Florida now has considered legislation, I think passed by one body in the House, and it's awaiting consideration in the Senate, where Florida would even move up before California, even at the cost, perhaps, of losing some delegates to the Democratic or Republican conventions, because under the party rules, you're not supposed to move up. They've got these four party things already set up, and in other states, you're not supposed to move up. But Florida, wants to leapfrog California, perhaps. And then the people who are behind this in Florida are even kind of leaving the legislation open-ended so that they don't want to decide what's going to go on until after the other states have decided. South Carolina is in the last week of January now for the Democrats and a couple of days later for the Republicans. But the Republican Party in South Carolina thinks that their role is going to be really diminished if Florida moves up or if some of these other states move up. And in South Carolina, the timing of the convention is set by the party leaders, not by the state legislature, by the party leaders. So the Republican leader in South Carolina just the other day was saying, we're going to be first no matter what. And he's saying, we don't care if we have to hold the primary on Halloween. We're going to be, the leader in this kind of process. I had a call from a reporter a few weeks ago from Alabama, because Alabama moved up. Alabama was late in the process. They want to move up too, and asked, well, what's the impact going to be? So, well, I can't say because it really depends upon what are the other states holding primaries at the same time. If your state moves up, you're having California, you're still going to be in the backwater. The candidates are not going to go to California, they're not going to go to Alabama. That's not going to decide anything. You win California, you're a major player all the way through the process out there. California trumps any losses otherwise. It creates an entirely new ballgame. Think of even when it didn't really matter. Primaries didn't matter that much. Bobby Kennedy wins the California primary in 1968 and was assassinated that night. It was a terrible tragedy. But, if his victory in California, that would really change the dynamics of the democratic process back there in 1968. So that's very important. So what we're seeing now is going to be a different type of primary process where it really gets front-loaded, where these states are really moving up, and where maybe half of the delegates will be selected by the end of February 5th. That's why all the candidates are out here right now, because you got to raise money, you got to get organized, you can't wait to say, okay, I decide to be a candidate in November next year. You can't do it because all your competitors are out there already doing the kinds of things you need to do in order to get organized. Okay, well, what does this mean? A couple of things. First, for the Republicans, the Republican Party. The most interesting candidate out there for the Republican Party right now, from a regional perspective, is Rudy Giuliani. mayor of New York City, most Democratic region in the United States. How does he win a Republican primary nomination? He's very liberal on lots of social issues. He still runs ahead of other, strategic advantage, does a poll here in Georgia among Republicans. Giuliani's first. It's not a high percentage of the vote, but he runs ahead of everybody else in the field right now. Okay, Giuliani is tailor-made to California. He's a California Republican type candidate. He could lose Iowa, he could lose New Hampshire or whatever. But if these other states move up and you've got a primary in New Jersey and New York, and even though Giuliani is controversial in New York, I think he'd win a New York Republican presidential primary. And I'm sure he'd win one in New Jersey and some of these other states. If these other states move up, it could well be that Giuliani does extremely well out there. If Giuliani does well there, then this may trump the weaknesses he has in these other southern states. It may not matter in terms of the nomination. So you got Giuliani out there. You got McCain, who looks like a much weaker candidate today than he was in 2000, both in terms of age and issues and reputation, national press, etc. All that. McCain's in a much tougher situation. He might be able to pull it off, but it remains to be seen. The others don't really look that strong. The most interesting other name out there right now is Fred Thompson, the former senator from Tennessee, who has a radio outlet. And Thompson probably appeals more to conservatives in the Republican Party than some of these other candidates. I think their strongest Republican ticket probably next year would be Giuliani Thompson. Fred Thompson, vice president, Giuliani president. If Giuliani were at the top of the ticket, and Thompson's down here as the ambassador to the conservatives, so to speak, on this, then it might be possible for the Republicans to hold their bases, their regional bases in the South and most of the Mountain Plains. But Giuliani, I think, would put into play some of those states in the Northeast. I don't think he would win New York State. I don't think if Hillary's a candidate or if Obama's a candidate, I don't think he wins New York against those candidates. But I think he could win New Jersey. I think he could win Pennsylvania. Maybe some of these other states where you have large numbers of Italians throughout the Midwest, throughout the upper Midwest. So Giuliani is the most interesting candidate that we see in terms of a regional analysis for politics, because he has the potential of getting the Republicans out of their regional strongholds and penetrating into an area that's just assumed to be a Democratic stronghold. And that's another way of illustrating what we do in terms of these regional analysis. These are tendencies in these regions. They're not fixed in stone. They change. People's preferences change depending on the options given to them. Now, for the Democrats, right now, we've got a very, very interesting race where Hillary Clinton is the kind of the front runner in the national polls right now. She's got her husband actively campaigning, for her. She's will have all the assets of the Clinton organization in terms of money, organization, strategy over the years. I think she is clearly the front runner. But Hillary has never been in a really truly competitive Democratic primary before. Really has no experience in primary. We shouldn't have to battle that way to get the New York Senate nomination, Democratic primary. Essentially, her main opponent got out of the race. This is new politics here. So it remains to be seen how well she is going to do as a candidate. Hillary also has very high negatives. What we would call, if you ask the percentage of voters, do you have a favorable or unfavorable impression? She'll get a high percentage of Americans who have a favorable impression, but she also gets a very large percentage who are unfavorable. Usually in most of these polls above 40%. If your unfavorable is above 40%, it gives you very, very little margin among the undecided voters to get up there to 50% in a two-candidate race. So there are lots of questions here in terms of electability, past positions in the war, that kind of thing. Barack Obama, I think, is the most interesting candidate. He really is a phenom. He's drawing mass attention, mass appeal, mass interest. He puts a new face on the Democratic Party in all sorts of ways. And were he to be the nominee, I think you'd have the highest turnout among African Americans and other minorities you've ever seen in American politics. I think he has the potential, to do that. Now, he's completely untested. He's first term as senator, and again, he's never faced an opponent like Hillary Clinton or an organization like the Clintons. The Clintons have a long record of taking care of Democratic primary opponents, out here too. That's so both Hillary has some new challenges, but Obama has some new challenges too. I'm sure the Clinton organization did not at all anticipate Obama's emergence. I don't think she wanted to announce as early as she did. I don't think she wanted to campaign as early as she did. But these are going to get lost in the process because of this excitement about Obama. John Edwards is out there again, making a second try. It's very hard when you come back, if you're the vice presidential candidate of a losing ticket, to come back and win the next time out. That's very, very hard to do. Edwards was on the ticket in part, I think, because the Kerry organization thought he would help them in a state like North Carolina, but he didn't. It was unclear to me that he could have won re-election as a senator from North Carolina. And the style of politics that Edwards does, which is a kind of two Americas, that's the kind of populist politics that really has not played very well in the South. I can't think of any major office holder in the South winning with that kind of strategy. Because one of the biggest changes in the South is the emergence of a huge urbanized middle class. Think about this. We talk about this in the book. The New Deal was overwhelmingly popular in the South. Roosevelt was more popular in the South probably than any other part of the United States. In part, that was because Roosevelt really wasn't dealing directly with racial issues. He was not challenging segregation. He was not, moving Dick Russell in ways that Russell didn't want to move on those kinds of issues. But the other big part of it was that they were pumping a lot of federal dollars into the South, which the South had never received before. You had a Republican president. Republican president putting federal money in the South. They put money in their regional, the North, the East, and the Midwest, and the West. So for the first time, you get dollars coming into the South. But the South is so poor in the 1930s, that very few Southerners had incomes high enough to be taxed. They're not taxed hardly anything. In the first congressional district of Texas, where we were raised, one person did an estimate in the 1930s. The percentage of people living in the first district of Texas who paid income taxes in the 1930s was less than 2/3 of 1%. Think about that. Less than 2/3 of 1%. Okay, so the Roosevelt New Deal literally is something for nothing. Something for nothing is the greatest formula for political success the world has ever known. If I give you that, well, now you got a middle class. Now you got a middle class who pays taxes. You got a tax-paying middle class. So now it's not a free lunch. Now it's something versus other things. A lot of my education on the tax issue came when I worked in the 1960s during college in a plant in eastern Texas, where we got paid every 2 weeks or so. And for the first time, these guys and myself, money is coming out, the difference between the gross and the net. The federal government is now withholding, money, pay those taxes. Well, their fathers didn't have anything withheld. This is a new experience for them. And let me tell you, every 2 weeks, there's a lot of cussing going on. And I don't know when the checks were open. Because even though it might have been small money, I don't remember what it was. I don't know, we're talking about $10, $15, $20, $25. Every one of them had another purpose they wanted for that money than giving it to the federal government. So there's a lot of cussing going on. This is not rich folks. This is middle class kind of stuff. And this becomes an economic issue where you now have to pay for government services, and that kind of changes the equation, and that's has been part of the Republican appeal in the South. Well, what we have now in presidential politics is an opportunity for the Democrats to make history in terms of the nomination of either a female candidate or an African American candidate or some other combination of a candidate, and also potentially for the Republicans to make history if they nominated an Italian Catholic as their presidential candidate. Republican Party historically in the United States was the party of white Protestants. White Catholics didn't have much to do with the Republican Party. This is kind of what we're talking about in terms of these interesting developments going on in American politics. Okay, well, I've talked too long about that, so we'll just stop at this point and then be willing to take questions. Yes, sir.
Which is your for the reason you believe that you had this major shift in the Northeast from the Republican to the Democrats?
Okay, that's a really good. I think it really began in the 1960s. because it was still basically a Republican region in the 1950s. Eisenhower's winning 52 and 56, and then a lot of strength for Nixon also. I think in the 1960s, when Barry Goldwater won the Republican nomination for president, that represented a Southwestern Republican coming to power who opposed the New Deal. Almost all the programs associated with the New Deal and in the Northeast, you have had an adaptation toward the New Deal in which the New Deal was part of the consensus, organized labor in the Northeast. Organized labor is very important, especially among public employees in the Northeast. Organized labor really got the right to do that during the Wagner Act in the 1930s during the New Deal period. So you have a candidate like Goldwater who's taking very conservative positions on civil rights, whereas the Northeastern Republicans had been liberal on civil rights. They voted for the Civil Rights Act of '64. So here's the Republican Party being given an ultra-conservative face on race, economics, foreign policy, and also the attitude of Goldwater. I mean, Goldwater had this famous quote one time where he said some days he wished the northeastern seaboard could be sawed out and just float out to sea. We'd be a better country. So without the Northeast out there. So you have the Republican leadership now under Goldwater really, just insulting and giving the back of the hand to the Northeast. So over time in the Northeast, it's become much more associated with the institutions and the interest groups that are tied in with the National Democratic Party. And this is really what you see when you look at voters in the Northeast is that white voters were essentially tied about the same. But the increasing diversification of the Northeast electorate in terms of African Americans, new minorities, Latinos, Asians, and other groups there, those groups are overwhelmingly Democratic. So when the white voters split evenly and the minority voters go strongly for the Democratic Party and they now become a fifth of the electorate, that gives the Democrats very easy victories. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Who did Obama beat in the Senate?
I can't remember. He's not really in the Democratic primary.
Well, that was
or in the Senate race.
In the Senate race. Yeah, that was a case where the Republican incumbent bailed out after one term. Forgotten his name. He replaced. Alan Keyes. Alan Keyes came in and ran a kind of a hopeless.
Yeah, but before him, wasn't there like an infidelity case against his opponent? That's the reason Obama.
I can't remember.
If that had never happened, we wouldn't hear of Obama today.
Well, I don't know. Republicans have a hard time in Illinois statewide elections. There was an issue about sexual improprieties having to do with the Republican candidate. It became a huge scandal, and then he had to drop out of the race, and then it went to Keyes, and then the thing was all over with. It certainly would have been a much more competitive race had he had a stronger opponent. But the Republican candidate, I think, had not held office before. He was someone new to politics also. Yes.
Do you see any changes demographically that will shift between Republican and Democrat? For example, the rise of the Hispanics in certain regions.
This is one of the things that we develop in the book, where you have the American electorate in the 1950s was basically 96% white. It was virtually all white. The electorate today is still majority white, but it's a smaller majority. It was 78% of voters in 2004 were whites. The other 22% were almost evenly divided between African Americans and what we call the new minorities, Latinos and others. And those groups, for the most part, Latinos are split in some of the southern states. Some they're not necessarily all Democratic, but the new groups coming in have been much more Democratic than the other. And as they increase in size, then that has generally been a plus for the Democratic Party. Where we're seeing examples of that right now, and where Democratic strategists see real opportunities, would be in these western mountain states like Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, which is already more Democratic than Republican, and Arizona. Those states where you have more minorities coming into the electorate as voters and coming in largely as Democrats, that has been seen by the Democratic strategists as a way of trying to take those states away from the Republicans and make those into, Republican states. So we see that. Here in Georgia, we don't really see that too much in terms of Latinos. Still a very, very small percentage of voters here in Georgia.
Do you see any possibility for rural white Southerners to come back into the Democratic Party?
That looks less and less likely over time. That is sometimes a kind of strategy that Democrats think about. What we've seen in the last several decades is the Republicans developing the strength first among college-educated whites in cities and suburbs and exurbs. But that has now increasingly penetrated into rural, small-town environments. That's certainly been the case in Texas during the 1990s. And you might say a word about Georgia.
The realignment of white voters in the South has kind of come from the top down when we look at these polls over long periods of time. And you get most of the Southern white voters are Christians, largely Protestants. Their social values are more conservative than other groups in the electorate across the country. And there's been a big shift among the individuals who vote, the characteristics of individuals who vote, not only in the South but in the entire United States. And in the 1980s, for the first time, certainly among white voters, a majority of white voters in the South now had some exposure to college. They'd gone to college, not necessarily graduated, but had gone to college. The white Southern electorate in the 1950s and 60s is dominated by whites whose education stopped at high school or below that. And that was really the backbone of the traditional Democratic Party. As we've gone through this, the whites who have the least amount of education are the least likely to vote. So they're out of the process. They have to be mobilized back into the system as voters. So an Edwards strategy would be to try to identify those and bring them back into the system. That is very, very hard to do. It's not impossible, but it's very, very hard to do. Because non-voting is a habit just like voting. And if you get in the habit of non-participation on Election Day, somebody's got to give you a pretty powerful motivation to break that habit and move in the opposite way. So strategies that are based on the idea, I can win if I can really enlarge the electorate so that non-voters become a major part of my constituency. I'm not saying it can't be done, but it's very hard to do, and most politicians really would not tie their fortunes to that kind of political strategy.
Merle, we have time for one more question.
One more question. Well, let's
Has there been any attempt to quantify the effect of immigration on these shifting patterns?
On immigration? In terms of voters? Well, we can see this in terms of the groups that become voters in the electorate right now. And there's certainly, immigration is a major issue. It's a tough issue to study from the point of view of the exit polls because they don't really ask a lot of questions about that. If they do ask questions about that, then you want to have a series of questions rather than just one question on that. But I think for the Republican Party, immigration has been a very tough political issue, especially among small business, community. But it's an issue that can hurt Democrats too. But it's going to be one of the most important issues as we go into the future because the country is really changing, and the politics eventually is going to reflect those demographic changes. Okay, thank you very much. What we do is right.